In chess, a pen is essentially where the defending piece can't move without giving up typically a more valuable piece. Now, there are only three types of pieces that can do a pen, and those are the bishop, the rook, and the queen. Uh, Essentially, any piece can be penned with the exception of the king. The king cannot be penned because it has to move or it could get skewered. Take, for example, this chessboard I have right down here, where we have black to move, and they decide to move their bishop to this spot right here. Now, after the bishop moves to that spot right there, the king has to move. It's not referred to as a pen, but it's referred to as a skewer. And when the king moves, that puts the rook in jeopardy, where the bishop can simply go in the next move and take the rook. So essentially, the king cannot be penned. That's referred to as a skewer. Any other piece can be penned, and we'll take a look at these three different types of pens that you can set up. The three types of pens are the absolute pen, the relative pen, and the partial pen. Let's go ahead and take a look at some examples as to how each one of these pens work. First, we'll start off with the absolute pen. Basically, an absolute pen is essentially where the piece that is getting shielded by the pen piece is the king. Go ahead and take a look at this example on the board and see if you can figure out how white can set up a pen. Okay, in this case, we're looking to set up a pen for white. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take the bishop, and we are going to move that to the C5 square. And what that does is that sets up a absolute pen right there. Now, essentially, right here, the rook cannot move, and if it does move, that leads to a checkmate by the king. So the rook cannot move in this case, and we have an absolute pen. Now, some of you might say, well, I can just take the king and I can move it to the E7 square right there. So we move the king to the E7 square. Well, if we do that, that still doesn't work because white can take the knight right there and move it to the F5 square right there. And what that does is that sets up a fork of the rook and the king. And so essentially we have a knight fork there, so the king still has to move. Now, if we take the king and we move it forward to try to put pressure on the knight can simply take the rook right there, and it is still protected by the bishop. So there's nothing the king can do to win some material back here. And that is an example of how an absolute pen works. Now let's take a look at a relative pen. And a relative pen is one where the piece shielded by the pen piece is a piece other than the king. But typically speaking, that piece is typically more valuable than the pen piece. So while you can move that piece out of the way, you're going to lose some material in the situation. Let's take a look at this example I have right here, and we are playing as white, and it's white to move. See if you can find the pen right here. And if you went ahead and guessed rook E1, you are correct. So we go ahead and move rook to E1, and what this essentially does is this pens these pieces right here. Black cannot move the bishop, or it's going to cost black the queen. And if black moves the queen, black will lose the bishop, as the rook will go ahead and take it there. And that is an example of how a relative pen works. The next pen that we're going to look at is called a partial pen. Now, with a partial pen, it can occur a couple different ways. First off, you could have a rook or a queen that are pinned along a file, which means they can still move along that line, but they cannot leave that line. Alternatively, you could have a situation where you have a bishop or a queen that are pinned along diagonal lines. Now, they can still move along that line, but they can't leave that line. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take an example of a partial pin. You might want to hit pause for a second and see if you can figure out how white can create a partial pin in this situation. If you guessed taking the rook and moving that to the e2 square, you are correct, and we're going to go ahead and do that here. Now, when the rook moves to the e2 square, what it does is it creates a partial pin. Now, the queen cannot move off from this line because the king is pinned behind the queen. So the queen can move anywhere in this blue line here, but the queen can't move off the line because that would result in checkmate, so that's an illegal move. And essentially, the queen is going to have to trade the queen for the rook, which is a bad exchange for the player that's playing black. And that essentially is an example of how a partial pin works. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at an example of a situational pin. And a situational pin can be somewhat tricky because it's kind of complicated. But essentially, what happens in a situational pin is that if we move the pinned piece out of the line of attack, it results in a situation that's detrimental to the player with a pinned piece. If you take a look at this example right here, playing as white, how can you create a situational pin? If you guessed moving the rook to the b1 square, you are correct. And what that does is that creates a situational pin of the knight. Now, black could take the knight and say, okay, I'm going to capture the bishop here. But what that does is that actually creates a problem for black. And if you see the next move, white can just take the rook and move up to the b8 square over there. Now black has a problem. Its king is in check, and after it moves the king, the rook is in a bad situation where it is going to be captured by white, which it is over there. Now, alternatively, if we go back to the situational pin here, black could just move the king and move it over there. The problem is that the knight is still going to be lost in this case. So the rook goes ahead and takes the knight in that case. Now, if we look at it from a mathematical standpoint, you're looking at two different trades. The first trade is you're losing knight, which has a material value of around 3, maybe a little bit less in an open game. So that essentially is one trade. Now, the other trade is a little more complicated. The other trade, you are giving up a rook, which has a value of 5, and that is probably worth a little bit more toward the end game and more in an open game. Now, on the positive side, black is gaining a bishop, where a bishop is worth 3, but their value goes up when you get to an open game. The problem for black is, after they make this trade, they're essentially playing with one knight against a rook, which is not going to win very often unless white is really bad at a number of things. And this wraps up our video on pins and chess. Thank you for watching.